On this Texas Time Machine, we will look at one of Round Rock's forgotten, celebrity-adjacent residents, John Malcolm Loving. This Texas Time Machine presents an attempt at conducting original research to piece together John Loving's World War II service story. To tell this story, we use some of the library's newspaper, archive, and genealogy resources. Let's begin telling John Loving's story by first mentioning his more famous family member. Barbette is one of Round Rock's most famous residents. Born Vanderclyde Broadway in 1899 to Hattie and Jeff, or Henry Broadway, his father's name is not consistent in various sources. He grew up in Round Rock before leaving and finding fame in France and throughout Europe in the 1920s and 1930s as a female impersonator, trapeze artist, and high-wire performer. Later, Barbette worked as aerial director for the Ringling Brothers circus shows and consulted on major Hollywood films such as Some Like It Hot, and was an inspiration for another film, Victor Victoria. In contrast to Barbette, John Malcolm Loving is one of Round Rock's unknown residents. John Loving was born June 30th, 1921, to Hattie and Samuel Loving. By the early 1920s, Barbette's mother had remarried and had a son, John Loving, Barbette's half-brother. Not much is known about John Loving's early life outside of his relation to his famous half-brother. He graduated from Round Rock High School in 1939 and joined the Texas National Guard in October 1940. He enlisted in the Army on June 12, 1941, and was transferred to the Army Air Corps the following year. By January 1943, he was stationed at MacDill Field in Tampa, Florida. On January 2nd, John filled out his application for family allowances, where he named both Samuel and Hattie Loving as dependents, with his mother being the recipient of any checks the family might receive. He shipped out to England in May 1943, but nothing else is known about his time in England between May 1943 and the summer of 1944, when Loving joined the aircrew of the B-24 he flew on the tragic Kassel mission. Unlike many aircraft, Loving's B-24 Liberator had no nickname. Known in the records by its serial number, 44-10497, it will be referred to as the Pearson crew, after its pilot, Ralph Pearson. John Loving had been assigned to the 8th Air Force, 445th Bomber Group, 700th Squadron, stationed at Tibenham Airfield near Norwich, England. One of Loving's fellow B-24 crewmen, Doy Lindsay O'Keefe, wrote of his war experiences and placed Loving's arrival between August 27th and September 10th, 1944. He described John Loving this way: "We received a new crew member, a fellow named G. Loving, from Texas. Never got to know him real good. He stayed off base with some gal in town." Proof that Loving had not spent much time with his new aircrew and remained relatively unknown to them is borne out by O'Keefe mistakenly stating his name incorrectly as G. Loving. Loving had replaced a man named Charles Allen, who left for medical reasons. O'Keefe says the strain of combat was getting to him. The woman O'Keefe mentioned was Loving's wife, Simone. Born in Lausanne, Switzerland in 1915, Simone Schopfer found her way to England and was listed in the 1939 England-Wales Register, a register compiled by the British government early in the war with the purpose of producing national identity cards. The two had married on July 18, 1944. A post-war article from May 1945 in the Austin Statesman mentioned that John Loving's sister, Mary Loving Cahill, had known Simone Schopfer's parents, but the article did not make clear how she knew them. It turns out that Simone's parents had emigrated to America in the 1920s and had settled in Austin. They were next-door neighbors of Mary Cahill. Mary gave her brother Simone Schopfer's name and address, and a marriage resulted. On September 27, 1944, the Pearson crew learned that the day's bombing run would be deep into Germany. Today's target would be the Henschel engine factory and Tiger tank manufacturing plant in Kassel, Germany. After breakfast and the mission briefing, crews went to their planes, and at 5:30, green flares went up signaling the moment to start each plane's engines. By 8:15, 37 planes had risen into the sky to fly the approximately 360 miles to Kassel. The Pearson crew flew in the low position, the most vulnerable position in a flight formation. They would make the journey under American fighter protection. The task of the P-51 fighter planes would be to engage any German fighter planes sent to destroy the bombers before reaching the target. However, once airborne and at flight altitude, a reported 70-mile-an-hour tailwind caused the bombers to miss their last turn southeastward to bomb Kassel. Now off course, the bombers flew eastward towards Göttingen, Germany, to bomb the railroad yards. Unfortunately, this change in plans meant that the bombers lost their fighter escort and would complete their bombing mission alone and unescorted. When over Göttingen, each plane carrying its 6,000-pound bomb load dropped their bombs and began a slow, clockwise turn to begin their return to England. The Pearson crew was with the group of bombers near Eisenach, Germany, when they were jumped by between 100 and 150 German fighters flying in line abreast formation, training their 20 and 30 millimeter cannons on the bombers. The German fighters came in from behind at 7:30 low on the first pass. As one of two waist gunners in the bomber, John Loving responded by unleashing his .50 caliber machine guns. It's not known how much, if any, damage the Pearson crew inflicted on the Germans. However, the German fighters exacted a tremendous toll on the American flyers. Pearson crew member Doy O'Keefe described the volume of incoming fire as hundreds of shells hitting the B-24 and bursting at his feet. He was amazed that he wasn't hit. The smoke of exploding shells filled the interior of the plane. The Liberator immediately caught fire as fuel from the right-wing tanks spurted into the bomb bay area, and within approximately 20 to 30 seconds was so fierce that O'Keefe could feel his face blistering and his clothes burning. Fortunately, the electrical circuits still worked to open the bomb bay doors, and O'Keefe was the first to leave the B-24 as he leapt out of the plane at 22,000 feet. Tumbling through space at first, O'Keefe rolled over on his back and observed that two more men had left the plane, their open chutes marking their descent. The plane continued to peel away from the formation until the right wing collapsed and the bomber fell like a flaming torch. The plane crashed near Lochroden, about 7.5 miles west of Eisenach. At the end of this firefight, 25 U.S. bombers were gone. Of the 238 men aboard the 25 bombers lost, 115 were killed in action or later died of injuries. The rest became prisoners of war as they were captured once on the ground. According to pilot First Lieutenant Pearson, when detailing his memories of the mission in the missing aircrew report after release from prison camp, John Loving, along with other crewmen Harry Tarkovsky and Dwight Gallion, left the burning B-24 above Eisenach through the camera hatch at the rear of the plane. Perhaps John Loving was one of the two open parachutes seen by O'Keefe. Pearson recalled the time as approximately 11 a.m. and about 15 minutes after bombing. Loving was not on the ground long before he was picked up by the Germans at around 11:30 a.m. Co-pilot Nelson Dimmick later remembered his landing. My right waist gunner, Harry Tarkovsky, landed about 50 feet away from me. I wanted to run for the woods, but Harry had an injured leg. A German officer on a horse came galloping up. The officer searched us for guns, but in vain. Harry, the other waist gunner, Dwight, and I were taken to a basement in a jail in Eisenach, only a short distance east of where Harry and I landed. The other waist gunner would have been John Loving. Although we do not know exactly what John Loving experienced while parachuting back to Earth or once he hit the ground, others captured near the village of Lochroden describe the macabre scene of having to pull decapitated American flyers out of their crashed planes and picking their shattered bodies off the ground in orchards and fields and putting them into horse-drawn carts. Some captured airmen were brought to the church cellar in Lochroden, while others were taken to Eisenach nearby. Along the way to the village cellar, German soldiers and civilians physically and verbally assaulted the prisoners with kicks and punches to the body and incomprehensible screamed orders. Most likely, John Loving witnessed and experienced these events. Eventually, Loving found himself in the town of Oberursel in Dulag Luft West, a transit camp for captured air crews. After this, National Archive records record his stay in Stalag Luft 4 in what is now Poland. That being the case, John Loving took part in what has become known as the March, a several hundred miles forced march from January to May 1945 to avoid liberation by the advancing Allied armies. These winter marches were in some of the coldest conditions seen in 20th century Europe. Blizzards with temperatures as cold as minus 13 degrees Fahrenheit in January and February, and temperatures hovering around 0 degrees through mid-March, killed hundreds of POWs as they marched across the continent. However, Loving appears to have been more fortunate to have been evacuated by train from Stalag Luft 4 as part of a group of POWs under the leadership of Clarence Guyder. Saved from having to march in the sub-zero temperatures, Loving and the other prisoners suffered extremely from deprivation, especially from the lack of water. After leaving the Stalag Luft 4 site on January 31st, prisoners could not disembark the train with the exception of the medical officer or Sergeant Guyder. Dysentery was the most common complaint of the Americans. On February 9th, the train arrived at its destination and Loving settled into Stalag Luft 3 near Nuremberg, Germany. He did not stay long in Nuremberg, as by April 4th, his group began the almost 100-mile march to Moosburg, Germany, where they arrived April 18th and were liberated in late April, early May. Back home on May 8, 1945, the Austin Statesman ran an article stating that John Loving had been awarded a Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters, but had not received them because he was a prisoner in Germany. Furthermore, the article stated that the medals were to be presented to his mother in the near future. A second article on May 11th confirmed that the medal presentation would take place on May 26th at Bergstrom Field. The citation read in part, "Displaying great courage and skill, this enlisted man has warded off many enemy attacks and has materially aided in the successful completion of each of these missions." After surviving the war and prison camp, John Loving came home to Texas, and the post-war years were not always easy ones. A war hero upon return, Loving struggled personally throughout the 1950s until later in the decade when he had put those difficulties behind him and enrolled at the University of Texas, where he received his bachelor's degree in education in 1960. He taught for a time in Encinal near Laredo and was involved in other causes championing everyday people in both South Texas and Round Rock. Interestingly, in the 1960s, John Loving revealed another tidbit of local history. At that time, Loving corresponded with the Round Rock Cheese Factory manager and city mayor Elmer Cottrell about the Sam Bass headstone, which Mayor Cottrell had come into possession of in 1964 as a way of preventing tourists from harvesting souvenirs by chipping away at the headstone. John Loving mentioned in a letter dated October 6, 1966, that he was in possession of the headstone of Sam Bass gang member Seaborn Barnes, erroneously referred to as Sanford in the letter, and would like the mayor to have it for safekeeping. Why would John Loving, of all people, have the headstone? It turns out his father, Samuel Loving, created the headstones for Sam Bass and Seaborn Barnes in the mid-1920s, and took the Seaborn Barnes headstone home because he did not want it to suffer a similar fate from tourists that occurred with the Sam Bass marker. Samuel Loving removed the headstone and, to quote the letter, put it on his horse and took it to his home. He made unflattering remarks about tourists and placed the Barnes tombstone at the kitchen door as a stepping stone. A follow-up letter from November 1968 confirmed the return of the 2 headstones to the Loving family from Elmer Cottrell. The Sam Bass headstone is still owned by the city of Round Rock. However, the present whereabouts of the Seaborn Barnes headstone are unknown. A few years later, John Loving's health began to fail. On January 16, 1973, he entered the VA hospital in Temple, Texas. After a stay of several days, John Loving died there of a heart attack on January 18, 1973, aged 51. Friend Mike Grimes wrote a remembrance that appeared in the January 24, 1973 Round Rock Leader, stating, "It's hard to know how best to describe who John Malcolm Loving was. I personally thought of him as the conscience of Round Rock, a person who had the strength and integrity to risk the alienation of the entire respectable community in the interest of a minority or an apathetic majority. John was a total individual. He was a strong man that many lesser men attacked and ridiculed because he untiringly labored on those causes that, although morally right, were not in the best interests of political expediency."